Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine takes us to Chinon, and we're looking at the Domaine Grosbois 2017 Clos du Noyer, Chinon. The history of viticulture at Domaine Grosbois can be traced back to the 15th century. Over the centuries, the domaine has thrived as a polyculture farm, with viticulture being a minor component of the domaine's practices. In the 1990s, the domaine as we know it today began to take shape under Jacques and Sylvain Grosbois, who began to focus a little bit more on viticulture. Following several years of making wine abroad, Jacques and Jocelyn's oldest son, Nicolas, returned to the domaine in 2006 and took up reins managing the estate. In 2019, Nicolas' brother Sylvain joined the estate as well. Today, Nicolas and Sylvain are farming around 20 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines that are primarily pledged in the commune of Panzoult in Chinon, with a very small parcel of newly acquired vines in the neighboring commune of L'Île-Bouchard. The estate today remains, as it has for centuries, a polyculture farm with biodynamics and biodiversity at the core of the domaine's philosophy. They raise cows and pigs, have a variety of fruit and nut trees planted, and some truffle oaks as well. In addition to this, they have beehives and a huge vegetable garden, which helps to supply vegetables to the local school. From the family's 20 hectares of vines, they are making several expressions of Cabernet Franc, which include, but are not limited to, the cuvée Gabare, which represents the estate's largest volume, as well as Clos du Noyer, which is their top expression of Cabernet Franc. And recently, they isolated a small 60-ar parcel of vines that were planted in 1905 from pre-phylloxera vine material, which they now vinify separately as the cuvée Clôture. These vines also serve as the source for all new plantings and replantings of Cabernet Franc at the domaine. In addition to their estate vineyards, the family is also working with a few vigneron-friends to source grapes to produce a few wines that are part of their négoce project, including the wine La Cuisine de Ma Mère, which has long been one of my favorite early drinking styles from the Chinon appellation. So the family's parcels are all located in the commune of Panzoult, with the exception of that tiny parcel that I mentioned in L'Île-Bouchard. And Panzoult is located just downriver east of the commune of Cravon-les-Coteaux on the north side of the right bank of the Vienne River. Panzoult is the second largest commune of production in the Chinon appellation after Cravon-les-Coteaux, which represents around 50% of the appellation's production. In Panzoult, there are really three areas for viticulture. The first is the alluvial plain, which is very close to the Vienne River, about 500 or so meters north of the Vienne. And this plain is at elevations around 30 to 35 meters above sea level, and it is essentially an extension of the same alluvial terrace that we find in Chinon. In terms of soils here, these soils are deep, sandy, silty soils with very little clay or gravels in them as well. And then we have a second pocket of alluvial soils that's located in the eastern part of Panzoult. This is set a little bit further away from the Vienne, about 2 kilometers north of the Vienne, around the hamlet of Roncé. These vineyards are at elevations around 40 to 45 meters above sea level. We have those sandy, silty soils again, but these soils are much stonier, anywhere from 25% to 100% stones or gravels, and these soils sit atop a gravelly subsoil. And then we have a small, narrow band of vineyards that are on the slopes, and these are set back about 2 to 3 kilometers north of the Vienne River. And the slopes follow a little bit of an arc shape, hugging the tree line of the forested area that is towards the north. Now the slopes here, the elevation is around 50 to upwards to 75 or so meters above sea level. And the slopes will be either south-facing or have a slightly more southeast-facing exposure, depending on where you are along that tree-lined area. Now, in terms of soils, as is the case across Chinon, when we're dealing with the slopes here, we're dealing with soils that are derived from the Turonian tuffeau chalk. And we will find the influence of either the middle Turonian white tuffeau chalk or the upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk on the slopes, depending on where we are. And in the case of the upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk, we do find pockets of vineyards, which are limestone-derived sands that have less fertility and a slightly higher water holding capacity than the alluvial sands that we find closer to the Vienne. Now, Domaine Grosbois and their parcels are located in the western part of Panzoult, very close, about a few hundred meters from the eastern border of Cravon-les-Coteaux. Their vine parcels are planted across a single lieu-dit called Le Pressoir, which is situated on a gentle south-facing slope about 2 kilometers or so north of the Vienne. Here, in terms of their parcels, they're actually divided into 19 individual plots, and they've isolated these and identified these based on soil composition as well as vine age. But in terms of soils across the board, we have soils that are derived from the Upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk, and the texture will vary and the depth will vary slightly, but we're mostly dealing with sandy or clay sandy textures here. Now, looking at Clos du Noyer a little bit closer, this is from a 1.2 hectare parcel of vines that is towards the very top of the slope at Le Pressoir. And this parcel was named as such by Nicolas and Sylvain's great-grandmother Thérèse because of the presence of the walnut trees that were planted very close to this particular plot. The upper portion of the vineyard was planted in 1994, and then they replanted the lower portion of the vineyard in 2020 via selection massal using those pre-phylloxera vine material coming from that parcel Clôture. In terms of soils, the depth of the soil ranges from about 50 centimeters to 100 centimeters or so, and we are at the top of the slope here, and we're on a little bit of an outcropping of miage. The texture is a sandy clay texture, and then this sits atop the Upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk bedrock. And I should note as well, the first vintage for Clos du Noyer was in 2005. Now, from a winemaking perspective, the fruit for this wine was all hand harvested, hand sorted, and destemmed. And the fermentation is whole berry in concrete with ambient yeast. And then in terms of the time on skins, we're looking at about 25 to 28 days or so. And they would have done some gentle pump overs as required just to homogenate the must and aid a gentle extraction. And then in terms of the élevage, aging was also in concrete for about 12 months. And this was a short élevage really to preserve the fruit character in the finished wine. So let's dive into this wine. Oh, I suppose I should talk about the vintage. This is a bit of a cellar grab for me. So 2017 would be considered normal vintage by today's standards, especially compared to 2018, 2020, 22. This would be considered a bit more of a normal, so slightly cooler vintage, more classic vintage, if you will. And in terms of the nose here, the nose is very open, very fragrant, very perfumed. And that makes sense. You know, we've got a little bit higher sand component to the soils here. And so I tend to get a little bit of a more lift to the nose in those instances. And then the profile, I would say, leans sweet, tart, and there are a mix of red and darker fruits here. The fruits lean in that kind of raspberry, there's a bit of cranberry, there's a bit of wild black raspberry here too. There's a little bit of like a foresty berry kind of thing going on. And in terms of the pyrazine profile, I would say that this wine definitely leans a little bit more savory. And the pyrazine profile is very classic. A bit of tarragon, some sage. There's a little bit of like a green, naturey thing as well, like moss, maybe some fern, a little bit of cedar leaves, not cedar wood, but definitely cedar leaves. There's some nice florals to the nose, like peony, jasmine, a little bit of spice too on the nose. Overall, the nose is really, like I said, it's very lifted, very translucent. There's a beautiful purity to the nose as well. Just very, very inviting. On the palate, that mix of fruits, sweet tart fruits, comes through really nicely. Like I said, there's a nice purity to the fruit profile as well, which I quite like. Pyrazines come through bang on as they did on the nose. There's a little bit more spice on the palate, which is often the case. I often talk about Cabernet Franc spice and that spice melange that the grape has. And, you know, this has not seen any wood whatsoever. So that spiciness is all kind of from the grape itself. And in this instance, it always tends to come through a little bit more on the palate than on the nose. But I am getting a little bit of like an allspice note. There's a touch of nutmeg here as well. There are some tertiary elements coming through a little bit. There's a bit of like graphite, pencil shaving, pencil lead thing happening. There's a little bit of an autumnal energy to the wine as well. And there's even a little bit of like a saltiness, like a salinity to the finish, which is really lovely. The acidity is quite brisk. It has a nice liveliness to it, a little bit of a crunchy profile as well. There's some nice juiciness to the fruit profile overall. The tannins are also very in keeping to what I would expect and what I've recalled from previous tastings of this cuvee. They are very firm, finely woven. There's a nice uniformity to the tannins. They have a nice crushed velvet texture to them, a little bit of like a chalky tug on the finish as well. You know, this wine has a lot of concentration and depth, but what's interesting about it is it has this very svelte kind of profile. So there's a lot of concentration and depth and intensity going on in a medium-bodied, svelte, lean, almost ethereal type frame. This wine is energetic. It has a very, there's a lot of forward momentum. It's very dynamic. And, you know, I know that I often refer to talk about soils all the time. And when I'm dealing with more chalky influence of the soils, more of that limestone influence of the soils, I do tend to feel a bit more of this forward propulsion to the wine that kind of makes you want to just dive back in and revisit it. And the wine in general, this wine in particular, it's very restrained, very graceful, and there is quite a lot going on here in such a petite frame, for lack of a better word. And I do feel like this has somewhere really special to go. You know, it's had some bottle age, but I can feel that there's enough concentration here and enough going on that this has got easily 10 plus years ahead of it. And I think it's going to get even better with a little bit more time. But it's a really beautiful expression of Chinon, particularly of a age-worthy structured style of Chinon from the slopes, from those Turonian tuffo chalky soils. And it's a beautiful wine, very elegant, very graceful, as I said, very finesse-driven, with a lot happening here in just in a very svelte type frame. And I've been following Domaine Grosbois for a very long time, since the beginning of my career. I used to taste with Nicolas at his stand at Pro Wine. We're talking, like I said, probably 12, 15 years ago now. And it's so great to keep following this domain and see their evolution and their progression and how they're kind of like constantly making little tweaks here and there as to what they're doing to improve and to get better. And this is actually the first time I've revisited Clos du Noyer with a little bit more focus. I've tasted this cuvee at various salons and other tasting events, but it's kind of cool to taste it on its own and really give it that attention, because there's a lot going on here, and there's a reason why this is their top expression from their vineyards. If you have a favorite cuvee from Domaine Grosbois, do let me know what it is in the comments below. Or if you have another favorite wine from Chinon or favorite producer from Chinon, I would love to hear what that is or who that is in the comments below as well. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.